Good afternoon, everybody. The challenges for higher education is the theme of 8 seminars on higher education in the coming months at this university. It's been instigated by the Center for Higher Education Governance, Ghent, new research center, for which I'm the project leader. It's part of the Department of Sociology. We're doing research on higher education, particularly higher education governance. And we think this is a good start with an internationalization of home series on this topic to engage in a debate on higher education. We have great performances, not this one, but the ones coming, of course, in the future on controversial topics that we've discussed before within our group. We have presenters talking about access, about performance management, about private and public function of higher education, and also contribution on European developments. We think these are salient topics in the area of higher education that we should address, that we should discuss. There's more information on the flyer, which you can find at the homepage for the social sciences. All the seminars, including this one obviously, are at the premises. So look out for the next presentations as well. Before I start, my special gratitude to Meta for helping me out in organizing this, doing most of the legwork around the flyers, the paperwork, setting up the computer. It will be podcasted. So if you want to be famous forever, say something in the discussion and you will be recorded out there in the archives for eternity. What I will do is just maybe in the sweeping statements, sometimes talk about the role of higher education, about its position in society, and talk a little bit about higher education as a special, between brackets, kind of organization. Is there something special about higher education? And towards the end of the presentation, I will present a number of challenges to higher education. Pretty straightforward setup, I think. As far as I'm concerned, I do not mind to be interrupted by questions or concerns or whatever you want to raise on the specific topics addressed. We have sufficient time to discuss this, so please do step up if you want to say something on the themes that we are discussing. Okay, higher education, what is it? Does anyone recognize this place, building? It's obviously having some Arabic connotations here. This allegedly is the oldest university in the world. So, the University of Al-Qarawiyyin in Fez, Morocco, allegedly, I say, established in 859. That apparently is the oldest higher education institution university we know. I've been looking for some more details on that, and you can find evidence for this university, not university in contemporary sense, but a learning institute, higher learning institute. Apparently there are also other countries who argue that they host the oldest university, and you can find stories about India, and if we dig deeper and if we learn to know more about China, probably we'll find out that already before Christ there were lots of higher learning institutions in that part of the world. But this is just to set the scene, to make you aware that we're talking about an institution which is pretty old. If you follow the history chronologically, we see emergence of higher education institutions, University of Egypt, Iran, contemporary Iran. We go to Europe, the earliest university is actually relatively young. 1088 in Bologna, so that's 1,000 years, a bit more than 1,000 years out, old, then Paris, Oxford, etc. Just keep that in your mind as we're talking about the roots of higher education. What's this? Cambridge, yeah. We recognize the buildings or the sort of buildings, so this is what I call an image or an icon of a university. We recognize this on the spot as a university or a university building. And for those who didn't see it, the picture is taken again from a slightly different perspective, a little bit more light. What I found funny is that we see in both pictures a boat, a different boat. Probably students are earning a lot of money to be there on the right moment for the picture to be taken and to be paid for that. But that is part of that icon. You see the building, you see the river, and obviously someone needs to be there on the boat. Anybody recognize this icon? Boston, Massachusetts. This is indeed MIT. MIT. Yeah? Another icon. The average American, maybe not the average American, but people would recognize this. Ah, that's the building of the university. Oxford. Yes. A few brownie points for the college. A new college. You recognize it. You recognize the university. You recognize this as the ceremony, maybe not so much embedded in our Ghent traditions, but the ceremonies that take place upon graduation, throwing the hats, enjoying the graduation ceremony. And this is another icon. We think about universities in a very traditional sense. We think of people dressing in their togas, enjoying the ceremonies of the university. That's one way to look at it. Old buildings, prestige, grandeur, elite. These are the kinds of associations you have with these pictures, exhibiting the rich intellectual culture and history, and hence legitimate institutions in our society. If you're coming from another world, you might come to a different conclusion. So why are these men dressed? Why do they change into colorful dresses? Are they beyond sell-by date? Are they exhibiting ceremonies, traditions which are not of this day anymore? There are two different ways you can look at it. What was your reaction? You close to this one? Impressed by the grandeur, by beautiful buildings, and the connotations you have with university life? Or there were some thoughts in your mind about, this is pretty old, dusty, stuffy. What I showed in terms of pictures is we're talking about the top institutions, allegedly, high-end rankings, well-known institutions, Oxford, Cambridge, MIT. There are thousands of other higher education institutions that are less well-known, or maybe not even recognizable. Continuing with impressions of what higher education is. It is one of my favorite reports done by Times Higher Education, the magazine in the UK. They went a couple of years ago to schools. And just talking to the kids at school and asking them, what do you know about universities? And I know it is tricky and it's not fair to present these images here as real, but it's interesting to look at how others see higher education. And they did interviews with 10-year-olds. This is what they thought about a university. I might have to go because I want to be a hair salon for a person. I want to be a firefighter, and I'm going to the university to learn that. My brother never went to university or college, and he hasn't turned out so well. On one hand, it's just funny, and don't take it too serious, but I'm using it for a specific purpose. So there are particular understandings of young people about what the university is. They were asked, can you give us some names of universities? Rabbit, Harbour, probably mixing it up with Harvard, which is a good one. I think that's in America. So yeah, okay, this pupil has a bit of knowledge about it. Oxford, like Libby and EastEnders, different kind of connotation this person had. And surprisingly, one of the pupils, can you mention a few institutions? Yes, King's College, London School of Economics, Imperial, London Met, Brunel. Who's going to university? Again, these 10-year-old, well, very rich people. Connotation being you need to be rich to be able to attend a college or a university. And the second one is hilarious, I think. I want to share that with you. Kids desperate for a girlfriend. That's why my brother's going. What did they say about professors? They bore people to death and make people have lots of headaches. They mix chemicals and blow each other up. They touch a wire and their hair shoots off. These are icons again, because you recognize these as well from famous movies where indeed the hair shoots off if you're doing a chemical or physics experiment. They talk posh, but my uncle knows a professor that doesn't talk like that at all. So there's a very nuanced take on it. And what's a professor? It's a Hogwarts teacher. Interesting, interesting. They write unusual things on the board. Yeah, that's so confusing. They went to other schools as well. Again, this is not rocket science. This is just explorative research. Just sharing thoughts about what higher education is about. 13, 14 years old appear to be closer maybe to what we think what higher education is about. There's a higher purpose. It's not only teaching. Purpose isn't to educate per se. It's to produce bigger, higher things, intellectual ideas. And loads of discoveries are actually made by people at uni, so it's there not just for teaching, but for finding out things as well. So at this age, students start to understand, people start to understand that it's not just about teaching and filling professors, but there is research taking place at universities as well. And these higher things are again powerful images. You recognize it, you can think about the story behind it, that scientists struggled for decades to reconstruct, deconstruct the DNA. And that has been, of course, a marvelous thing to discover. And I can't emphasize how important it has been for further developments in the science, in biological sciences and in medicine. This one as well, I would argue. Apparently, man has been able to have this thing travel for about 60 million kilometers to Mars, and even send us pictures back. Sometimes difficult to imagine, certainly for a social scientist like we possibly all are, that this has been made possible through science. It's a combination of all kinds of sciences that has made this possible. You recognize this? So it's the deeltjes versneller. I'll say it in Dutch because I don't know what the English term is. Accelerator? Yeah. Yeah. So another powerful image. So it's not just the technology of building this thing, but the whole thinking behind it of being able to have a particle moving around and to do all kinds of interesting findings. Higgs boson particle, of course. Less powerful images. I've got these pictures from the websites. The previous one, obviously this one as well. Every university is using the same thing all over. In our university, if you look carefully, you will find an image of a guy or a lady standing behind some chemical apparatus and dripping something into another thing. That's another icon. This is what we think about when we think chemistry. But if you're really into chemistry, you probably have all kinds of different images and understandings of what it is all about. Harmful images. You get what I'm trying to say? You recognize this guy? Dr. Strangelove. Yes, speak to us. Not a nice person, was he? A clear icon of the mad scientist. It's more for an older audience, as you can see. Dr. Jekyll on the left, Mr. Hyde on the other. Again, the mad professor doing all kinds of experiments in the lab. Yeah, you recognize him, Frankenstein. And this is from Metropolis. It's one of the oldest examples, I think, of a mad scientist. Maybe less harmful because it's brought in a very jokingly way, and maybe you can see through Jerry Lewis in the Nutty Professor. He's acting strange, but he's playing over the top, so you can relate to that maybe and bring the nuance. And luckily, when we talk about films, movies, theaters, etc., we also see examples of professors being human. The one on the left I don't have to explain. The one on the right, you recognize? Yeah, Beautiful Minds. Yeah. Where we not only see, partly see his struggle, his scientific struggle, but more his struggle as a person suffering with the problems he had in life. Okay, so that may be a reassurance that it's all black and white, and so not only the mad professors running around in higher education. Although, maybe some scientists are too human. You get what I'm saying? Do you recognize any of them? See the example over there? So Gutenberg, maybe less known, Bax from the Free University Amsterdam. And this is Korean scientist Hwang. He got well known before they discovered things about cloning technology. These are examples, not only examples. I think there's now a wave of broad scientific integrity issues around in higher education. They're in the spotlights. You see a lot about this in the newspapers, in the magazines, and more these examples pop up. What I read today in a newspaper was that a computer program, or a Springer, the German publisher, withdrew 120 articles from their archives. 120 is not that much, given that they publish so much, but 120 articles were withdrawn because they were fabricated by a computer. Well, apparently there are people around, not us, but there are people around who use computer programs to write articles, nonsensical articles, and these nonsensical articles are published. And then you need dedicated software to discover whether this is fake or not. Another image, because that's the darker side of higher education. If we look at higher education from the economic perspective, just a few examples, you can find plenty on the internet, all kinds of reports. International education, we're talking about Australia here, contributes around 50 billion Australian dollars annually to the economy, and it's Australia's largest export service. So it is a key element of the Australian economy. Australia did not have higher education as an export. It would be pretty worse off in economic terms. Also, if we look in a more broader pattern to the returns to higher education, every investment in higher education, the jury is still out there what percentage actually is, but you can argue that for every euro we put into higher education, we get about €1.08, €1.12 back in terms of yields, economic yields. Private returns, you as a student, are even higher, 15 to 25%. Okay, so higher education is business as well, from the economic perspective, financially. Let's pause here and wrap this up as an intermediate assessment. On one hand, an old institution, existing for thousands of years, some would argue. Is it still very vibrant? It's cracking at the seams. Currently, we see many negative connotations with the concept of the university and higher education in media, in a broad sense. Now, the newspapers do say a lot about scientific fraud. If we look at entertainment media, we quite often see a negative image of universities, and particularly its professors, the mad scientists. I don't want to dwell that long upon these negative connotations in the entertainment media. Others have written about that. It could partly be a caricature. We have to use caricatures, otherwise it wouldn't be exciting. If everything is nuanced in movies, it's not fun. So we need these kinds of caricatures. Part of the image of the mad scientist can be traced back maybe to fear for the incomprehensible. Scientists are working at the boundaries of the disciplines, are discovering new things, and that is difficult to grasp for the average man, woman. And it's a little bit scary because discoveries can be made that can change the world. So to some extent we can relate to that, and indeed scientists, some of them are a bit weird. These negative connotations of higher education should be matched with what is another narrative in higher education. The wonderful yields of higher education, both at the private level, your return on investment upon graduation, and society collectively, because for every euro we put in higher education, we get something back as a society. Any reflections from you at this side, at this moment? Do you recognize this? Is there anything missing so far? What I try to get across is that there might be a kind of love-hate relationship between society in general and higher education. Not being sure what it is all about, the uncertainty of research, the incomprehensibility of what they're doing in the labs, knowing that higher education does have a good reputation in business life. This all warming up to allow me to forward the key pieces of the presentation. I would argue that higher education, as an institution, suffers from high levels of vulnerability. And that is not something that just emerges now. It's not talking about crisis or crisis. Because if you look at the word crisis in combination with higher education, I can give you examples of texts that have been written 80 years ago, 100 years ago, which were already talking about the crisis in higher education. So if we're talking about a crisis in higher education, I would say it's an ongoing crisis. And there's variations on the themes that are addressed. And maybe, if we want to connect it to, maybe the real crisis is indeed that level of vulnerability of higher education as an institution. Let me unpack that in more detail, why I think higher education is a vulnerable business. I think that is visible in many aspects of the higher education fabric. Take first its core processes. I'm using an example here, a definition by Clark, quite old but still relevant. It's good to understand that higher education is about knowledge. Knowledge is the key thing we're working on. As staff, as students, the whole community is engaged with knowledge. It's the manipulation of knowledge we're interested in higher education. Because we discovered through research, we conserve, we literally conserve when you're in architecture and archaeology, but we also conserve by putting it into the archives, by writing things and trusting them to the archives. We refine, we test and retest certain hypotheses and theories. We transmit and apply it. That's more the teaching side of it. We educate the next generation of students through the handling of knowledge. I would argue that these two processes, these two core processes, research and teaching, are very complex and know very high levels of uncertainty. These are actually intangible processes. We know from psychological and educational research how learning takes place, but actually we're just scraping the surface. How do I know what you take from this seminar? I don't know what your background is. I don't know what your motivation has been to come here. I simply don't know. I can make a test, of course, check afterwards what you did get, content-wise and reflection-wise. But it is very difficult to get a grasp on what the teaching process is. That even more is the case for research. We do research, but it's an endless journey, because we don't know what the results will be of the research. We don't know whether the experiments are set up in the right way. We don't know if we took into account all the relevant variables in our research designs. It is a little bit trial and error, and we don't know what the outcomes will be. And even if we know what the outcomes will be, the applicability of those outcomes, we're not sure about. We are still, using the example again of DNA, living with a legacy of things that have been discovered 20 years ago, and we only now profit from that. The fact that there is now this strange machine on Mars is the result of an evolution of hundreds of years of thinking about physics and astronomy. So we are not sure about these processes. A high level of uncertainty about the process and the outcomes, both for teaching and for research. Not only in processes and outcomes, but also the contested terrain of what is really knowledge, the nature of knowledge. Without going into the philosophical debates on that, I contrast how we looked at knowledge a long time ago and how we look at it now. It's a bit of a cliche, but I think you could go along with the statement that previously would say, if you study hard and long, and know more and better than anyone else, you can enter the world as an academic professional. It's a matter of studying, and showing your expertise once you are in your job. It's a cliche, and it's probably not a crucial summary of what it really is. Nowadays, I would argue, you need to be a specialist. You can't be a generalist anymore, because you will be outcompeted by somebody who knows more about the specific subdiscipline. So generalists are hardly there anymore. You need to specialize in a certain area. Knowledge is much more contested nowadays than it was centuries ago. Centuries ago, if the professor said something, that was the truth, between brackets. But now, with the media, with experts of different kind of nature, with things like Wikipedia, apparently there are other ways to get a knowledge and to show that knowledge than simply through a university education. The fact that we are nowadays, as scientists, specialists, or need to be specialists, goes along with another development, that we are not sole researchers anymore and teachers, but we need to have a broader skill set, a much broader skill set nowadays in academia. So you can't concentrate anymore as a researcher only on research. You have to teach as well. Fine, of course, it's great that these two are connected. But you also need to be able to communicate. You need to be able to understand how ICT works. You also need to know ICT in a broader sense that you need to handle with the electronic platforms there are. You need a much broader skill set than maybe 50 years ago, where this beautiful green thing was sufficient to do your thing in the classroom. You also need to know something about the psychology of teaching. You need to be educated in how to teach. So that skill set is quite different from nowadays. And if we look at higher educational institutions, organizations, whereas they 50, 100 years ago were mostly populated by academics and students, nowadays more than 50% of the workforce in higher education are non-academic. And I don't mean that in the pejorative sense, because they are something. They are not non-academic. They are, of course, they have an identity of their own, and they are of crucial importance to the university. But I'm just stating the fact that the population of the university is quite different nowadays than it was 50, 60 years ago. So the core processes are different, the nature of knowledge is different. And I would argue that the uncertainty is also hidden in the higher education institutions themselves. We saw these beautiful images, Cambridge, MIT, they're of course top research institutions. But what is actually happening behind the architecture of these buildings? Are they really strong institutions in the sense of strong actors? Can they really make a difference through their behavior? Are they agile? Are they lean? Or are they closer, to use similar kind of comparisons, are they the dinosaurs of this world? Difficult to move, remnants of the old days. Some would argue, particularly government representatives, that higher education institutions have been granted much more autonomy in the past 2 decades. They get much more leeway from the government to do what they want to do. Few strings attached, but fewer than 2 decades ago, where the government said you have to do this and you have to do it in this way and you have to perform like this. Nowadays there's more scope for institutions to do what they think is the best way forward. They've been granted more autonomy, but whether they have become more strongly and robust actors, I'm not sure. Give you a few insights, and I hope you can see it, otherwise I will read it out. This is research done by colleagues from the European University Association. They were curious how levels of autonomy differed throughout Europe. Won't bother you with the details, but just to give you a clue of how diverse the situation is in Europe regarding institutional, organizational autonomy, freedom from the state, literally. United Kingdom scores very high. It's a calibrated scale, so it's not literally 100%, but they are the highest. So totally free from the state, although they receive funding, obviously, but they can organize themselves in any way they want. And there are other systems which have high levels of organizational autonomy, like Denmark, Finland, Estonia. But if you go lower down to the bottom of the scale, the table, you see countries or states in Germany. I mentioned Latvia, 61%, France, 59%, Hungary, 59%, where the level of organizational autonomy is quite different. So what I would like to argue is that despite the narrative of governments granting more institutional autonomy, might have been a policy, but in reality this is experienced in a different way in many European countries. We can't use Flanders or Belgium here as benchmark, unfortunately, because it wasn't part of the research. But I would argue that it's not that far away from the Netherlands in this respect. So there would be a middle range in terms of organizational autonomy. Autonomy was not given for free to the institutions because governments asked something in return. Okay, we're willing to give you a little bit more autonomy, sort out your own stuff, but you still need to report, you have to account for what you're doing to the government. And that's why we have quality assurance systems, and that's why we have reporting systems with annual reports, financial reports, and all kinds of reports coming from the university to the government. Government works at arm's length, still at a distance, steering the higher education institutions. So even if you would argue that the institutions have a little bit more autonomy, I would argue that that is particularly visible at the top of the institution, the top management teams of the universities, maybe not necessarily in Flanders, but definitely in a lot of other countries where they are not chosen, they are not elected, but appointed. We can see strongish leadership from people at this position, more power located at the top of the institution, and being able to strategically lead the university in a certain direction. Whereas that may be true, at the same time we need to understand that at other parts of the university, that institution is becoming, I would argue, much more porosity at the lower levels. The university is very much open to import new disciplines and new subdisciplines. The demarcation between what real science is and not real science is a very thin line. So the control over who's in and who's out is not so much determined by people at the top level. That's dealt with at the lower levels of the organization. That's one sign of openness of the university, I would argue, to society. Another very important element are the human resources of the university. 40 years back, France, if you look at the statistics, I didn't, but I would guess that we would have 80% of staff being permanent. If you look now at the percentage of permanent staff in our universities, that's much lower. You could find some information on the US. 40 years ago, 70% of the staff was permanent. Nowadays, 70% the other way around. 30% only on a permanent contract and 70% hanging in the air, fighting for a new contract every year. That in itself may already be a disturbing fact for any organization, whether it's higher education or not. But the fact that you have to live and work in a situation where you're refining knowledge with people who are in your institution that might disappear in a couple of months and are replaced by others is a bad sign, I would say. So these staff members who are only temporarily there maybe do not engage fully in the core processes. We struggle maybe as higher education students from high levels of brain drain. Strong at the top, but lower in the organization, very vulnerable. I'm using that word again. So in its core processes and its outcomes, lots of uncertainty. We see that as well in the organization itself. The university is not, I argue, the strongest actor. You can't compare it to a business organization with much more strategic leeway. I would argue that higher education, but also because of the nature of knowledge, is in this sense a very vulnerable institution. And it always has been. And the interesting puzzle may be, how can it be that this institution survived over the centuries in a similar way as it was 1,000 years ago? I think that's an interesting puzzle for research, not so much for me in the philosophical sense as we are discussing it now, but to zoom in on specific elements of the fabric and to analyze the vulnerability. For the purpose of this presentation, I would say there are two ways you can go about this. You can say universities, higher education institutions have been around for so long and will continue to exist. No doubt about it. The businessman would say performances in the past are not a guarantee for performance in the future. So where are we? Are we at a certain stage now in the evolution of the university or higher education in general where we have a typical point where the vulnerability is so strong that it all will fall apart? Or not? Is the institution, because of its tradition, so strong that it will survive for a few more centuries? If we take it personally, if it would exist for another 40, 50 years, we as a collective would be happy with that, but of course we have to look for to the future as well, our children and the next generation. So where are we on that debate? Well, let me try to put a few of these threads together in what I would argue are four key challenges. There are obviously more, and you can be as refined as you want to be. You can say, well, there are 10 challenges. I just want to share 4 of these with you, and you can use that for further debates on whether they are likely to emerge soon or not, or whether you agree whether it's a challenge or not. I think a key challenge is in the area of technology. Within universities, we are, frankly speaking, working with outmoded technologies. We're still using the classical form, as we do now, seminar, a lecture, whereas there are so many other means of communication and learning available, and we do not apply them a lot in higher education. Yes, we're making use of information and communication technology, but not much. The expectations in the 90s were, when the universities were really, and particularly network universities were coming into the university, were very optimistic that we would have mega universities where everybody would be connected to universities through distance learning. Yes, we do have still distance learning institutions and the open universities, but not at the scale that people expected them to pop up in the 1990s. So the high hopes of the ICT revolution in higher education have not been lived up to. So we're still working with that, and there are challenges there. You know some of the challenges, the MOOCs, the massive open online courses that are now on offer. It may be a bit of a hype, but you can do any course you would like to do now, just sitting at home and using Google or any other search machine and follow a course at many universities for free. The key thing being that you don't get qualification for that course, and you can't do an exam, a real exam which will lead to a grade and a piece of paper saying, yes, you've done that course and you've been successful. But all the information on the courses can be found. Using the example here of Anja Kamenet's book, Do It Yourself University, she's writing about these things. A few years back, now it's already a bit out of date. It's going so quickly, all these developments. But she's arguing that the way youth today is learning, is educated, is engaging with technology should lead to revolutions, actually, in higher education. They don't. So students will sort out themselves. They will find their own learning paths outside of our highly evaluated institution, university. If you're interested, look for Kamenet's on TED. There's a fact presentation there on this particular topic. So there's a challenge there that we may not sufficiently cater for our clients who can in practice, our consumers, our students. The students of the next generation might want other ways of learning and teaching than we currently provide. That's one in the area of technology. It's already mentioned the support for higher education. Along the lines of my argument that it is a vulnerable sector, governments may look at higher education in a similar way. Actually being on the seesaw of, yes, we know that higher education is very important and we need to invest in higher education and research, but at the same time we might be throwing a lot of money at universities and not sure about what the actual outcomes are. Governments definitely support higher education if you read policy reports. But if you look at practice, they don't necessarily support that by real financial support. And neither do they necessarily do that with good, appropriate policies. Higher education institutions still have to get used to a situation where they are dependent on various stakeholders, various donors for higher education. I think it would be an illusion to go back to the golden age where governments would give all the money needed for higher education and research. Those times are over, and unfortunately there's no way of going back. Governments would now decide, instead of giving let's say, 70% of the total budget for higher education go back to 100% of the budget, it would be bankrupt in a few years. There's so much money going on in higher education and research that there's no way back. So others, governments argue, should give financial means to higher education institutions. The higher education institutions themselves should learn that game and deal with that. And that's a difficult one, because it's not dealing with the government as an enemy to get more money, but at least it was a friendly enemy because they gave the money in the end. It's now a complicated game of negotiations with all kinds of stakeholders in society, business, students, maybe paying a small fee, maybe paying a higher fee. It is dealing with parents of critical consumers. So the game becomes more complicated than it was a decade ago. So I would argue that finding support for the core activities, teaching and research, will be pretty difficult in the near future. Third challenge, I've tried to argue that I think that higher education institutions are still pretty vulnerable, strong at the top, maybe strong leadership, but they're tankers and it's difficult to move. They can turn around, but it takes a lot of time. The dinosaurs, in many respects. There is maybe plenty of scope for entrepreneurs, for entrepreneurial organizations, including private business organizations, that can outcompete the traditional higher education institutions. We do see that emerging in various countries, where we see private, small businesses that now organize higher education, give courses, accredited courses, and students are generally happy with that kind of education. They can go to the labor market with the qualifications, and it seems to work well. Now small scale, but it is thinkable that this is only the start of a curve where many more entrepreneurs stand up and say, I can do better than a traditional university. If you're interested, Christensen and Eyring written about the innovative university. They do take their own institutions as point of departure, so they are arguing that their universities should change considerably. But you can read the book also in another way, saying if you really want to keep up as a higher education institution, radical change and different organizational structures and outputs are needed. So that third challenge is in the area of strategy of higher education institutions. And the final challenge, picking up a point that estimate, the enemy within. Can you imagine that the most important resources of higher education institutions, academic staff, sorry, not students in this case, what if they would flee the ivory tower? Maybe not likely on the short term, but a few pointers that might hint in this direction. Recent worldwide satisfaction, job satisfaction research. Overall job satisfaction, taking examples from Europe, on a scale of 1 to 5. Seniors in Switzerland, senior researchers in Switzerland are pretty content. 1 meaning high level of satisfaction, 1.9. But junior researchers in the UK are on the other end of the tipping point, of the middle point of the scale. So they're at, they're still positive, of course. The middle point is 3, 1 to 3 to 5. So, but juniors in the UK are much less satisfactory about their job than in many other countries. And if you unpack that a little bit, 20% of the junior researchers in the UK, 1 out of 5, have a low level of satisfaction, score 4 or 5. And in Ireland, that is 18%. look at a statement, a key item in the research, I think. My job is a source of considerable personal strain. 27% of the seniors in Italy say no. Agree with that. So 27, already 1 out of 4 would agree with that. 61% of the senior researchers in the UK, almost two-thirds, 2 out of 3, say my job is a source of considerable personal strain. First message is there's much more pressure on academic staff nowadays. Would that lead to a departure, fleeing from the ivory tower? That is the question, obviously. There are signs that that is indeed the case. Would not do it again. 20 to 30% of researchers in the UK would say like that. And there's also another item, I would recommend this to others, where they are quite negative about giving a recommendation to friends to come to the university as a student, or as a PhD student, or as an academic. Signs of burnout and opt-out. On the positive side, there are many positive items in these kinds of surveys. If you would ask an academic, why do you like your job? They say, because I have the freedom to do what I want to do. Yes, I have to teach under durable conditions. Yes, the challenges regarding research, they are there. But still, I enjoy my job because I can do what I would like to do. I'm working in an area where I have a lot of interest in, a lot of expertise, and I can live with that situation. So whether there will really be burnout and opt-out is a question. I know there are people in the audience that are familiar with this theme as well, so maybe they want to say something about it. But I think there is something burning in the background. It's not really visible nowadays because the older generation seems to be pretty confident about how the universities work. For the younger generation, and particularly the inflow into academia, who would nowadays really choose an academic career? There might be challenges there for higher education, and if their human resources are not there, of course the functions cannot be performed, and that would be the end of the university as we know it. Again, 4 challenges, could have been 5, 6, or whatever. How this will all evolve in the near future is the big question. I like this one, I'm using it a lot, and I know some of you have seen it probably often. It's difficult to predict, particularly when it regards the future. As old Chinese proverb, yeah, we don't know. If you look at predictions that have been published years ago, most of these scenarios are pretty conservative. I've done a few of these studies myself as well, going back 10, 15 years, and when we did predictions, scientific predictions, arguments about how the things would evolve, we would still stick to a kind of system of higher education in the Netherlands, in Flanders, or in Europe, where we would recognize the University of Oxford, the University of Ghent, the University of Amsterdam as entities as we know them now. We are not very revolutionary in our thinking, neither are respondents to Delphi methods that we are using for these scenarios. Most of the scenarios still accept, in line with what some of you said, well, the university will be there in 20 years, in 50 years, in 100 years. So that is very difficult to say, and it's up for us to find what will happen. Radical change? I don't know. Higher education is, I argue, a very vulnerable institution. It is under a lot of pressure. It may be that because of the institutionalization of its organization, we as organizations are resilient at the same time. That sounds contradictory, sounds paradox, but because we have embedded our processes so much in institutionalized patterns, there might be enough resilience in the organization to survive for a couple of decades. It might be that there's a gradual change in line with some of the arguments that you explored with me. In a couple of decades, higher education will look rather different, and that may be an open door. But anyway, it is good, I think, to reflect on these kinds of issues, to look for the vulnerabilities, if there are any, in the higher education fabric, and to contemplate how that affects your work, either as a student or a staff member in academia. I would like to thank you for your attention.